Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Unit 3 lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about ethical considerations. And what do we need to think about as researchers in order to be able to conduct ethical and legal research? So the first thing is that we need to understand that research is typically conducted with people, right? So we have a responsibility to protect those people, to build trust with them, promote integrity of research, guard against misconduct, and cope with any new problems that emerge. For example, 10 years ago, a lot of the issues that we have to deal with today regarding social media and technology didn't even exist. So we have to think about all of those things as they're emerging, and sometimes even ahead of our code of ethics changing, we have to think through what are the potential ethical consequences of this action? What are the ethical values I can apply to this new issue and new problem? So your textbook, Creswell and Creswell, they go over some ethical issues to anticipate. Prior to conducting your study, you definitely need to examine your professional association, which is for us the ACA Code of Ethics from 2014. And you need to really understand what the code says about conducting research. And so we're going to do an activity at the end of this PowerPoint to help you do that. We also need to know that we need to have a review board. Even if you're a private practitioner, you need to have some sort of review board established that can review your research and see, is it ethical, is it legal, have there been things that you haven't considered? You need to gain permission from the site and the participants. So you can't just go on Facebook and, observe what's going on in a discussion and take and report that as research and then, report what people said and did, because you didn't have informed consent, you didn't have the consent of the site, lots of things there. So you have to have a complete, informed, transparent process with permission to conduct the research the way that you're planning to conduct it. You also need to select a site that's really not vested in the interest of the outcome of the study, because you don't want any pressure from the site to report your results in some way. So you want to really avoid any of those power issues that you can. And then you need to negotiate the authorship of publication before the publication is written. So typically the first author is the individual who has contributed the most to the research. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important not to reorder authorship of articles when you're creating a citation, because you want to make sure that authors are given credit for the type and the amount of work that they've done in each of the studies. So when you begin a study, you need to make sure you've identified a research problem that will actually benefit the people you're using for research. So that might involve a needs assessment, informal conversation, a review of the literature, what's going on and can we really help the situation? Disclose the purpose of your study. You're going to learn that there's a big difference between problem statement and a purpose statement. And the purpose statement needs to be clearly articulated so that review boards, sites, and participants can give informed consent. And you don't ever want to pressure your participants about signing consent or staying in a study. In fact, we want to make sure that they completely understand that they have the right to leave a study and be part of that process completely voluntarily. We do want to respect the norms and charters and cultures of indigenous societies. We want to make sure that we understand what those cultural, religious, gender, etc., differences are, and how can we incorporate that and be respectful. An example of that is if you're looking at gender, for example, that you don't exclude transgender, that you give an opportunity for individuals to self-disclose what their gender is as much as possible. And then also being sensitive to vulnerable populations. Children's the first one that comes to mind, but there's also pregnant women, individuals in prison, anybody who's in a situation where they may not have or perceive having rights as a full voluntary participant. So we need to make sure that we are sensitive to those vulnerable populations and get consent and also consider the risk. So collecting the data, we need to definitely respect our sites and not disrupt the site as, we want to disrupt them as little as possible. We want to build trust and anticipate any potential disruptions and minimize that as much as possible. We need to make sure that all participants, even in experimental research, have access to the same treatment. And this is something that I had to deal with a lot in IRB, where students would propose research where they would be giving a treatment and then they would deny treatment to another group and want to compare the results. That's fine to do, except you need to then also offer, after you've collected the initial research, offer the treatment to the control group, because it would be unethical to deny them access to something that you feel like could benefit them. You don't want to deceive participants. There are some studies where a level of deception is allowed, but it has to be very well and solidly supported, and then there has to be a debriefing that happens after the participants have the study so that they can know the true meaning of and the true intent of that study. And you want to be respectful of potential power imbalances, and you want to avoid exploiting participants. You want to not ask leading questions or share your personal impressions, or, avoid disclosing sensitive information or talk about what other participants have said. That would be very bad. And you want to avoid collecting harmful information. You don't want to put your participants at risk. So you have to really think about, okay, if I collect this data, am I willing to do something with it that may also be related to counseling? So for example, if I'm studying suicidality in adolescents, and I find that, 5 of my 10 participants are in fact suicidal, I can't just ignore that information. I also have responsibilities as a counselor. So I have to be willing to act on that. And did I inform my participants that there was potential that if they shared that I might have to commit them? That would be a very important thing to disclose in your informed consent, and to explain so your participants can give a full consent, to the process, because they need to understand all of the implications and consequences that could come of them actually participating in the study. One other thing I will say about collecting your data is that once you give IRB your informed consent and your questions, you cannot modify those without going back to IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board, and getting a modification. There's a little bit of a caveat in qualitative research, because there's some understanding that in some forms of qualitative research, because of the nature and of the interview process that you're doing, that other questions may emerge, and you would want to report those in your report. But definitely the quantitative components, and most are qualitative, you're going to want to stick to the protocol that you have had approved, because if you don't, you could be shut down. And if you had funding, you could lose funding, and even the whole school could lose funding if there's certain violations of the research protocol. When you're analyzing your data, you want to avoid kind of what they call going native, and that's siding with your participants and not disclosing all of the information and only disclosing positive results. That's a big no-no. And then respecting the privacy and anonymity of your participants, especially important in qualitative research when you have much lower numbers of participants in a very specific area or community. So it's much easier for people to identify those individuals. So you do have to change some of the information just enough so that the person is not as identifiable. When you're reporting, sharing, and storing your data, definitely avoid falsifying information. That would not go over well. Plagiarizing is definitely a no-no. You want to make sure that you give people credit using APA format for work that they have created and done. This includes instruments. This includes any protocols for types of counseling or interventions. So anything anybody else created, you need to give them credit for it, and full credit. The whole group of authors that did it needs credit. You need to communicate in very clear, straightforward, concise language. Share your data openly with others when they ask to look at it. You need to keep your raw data and materials for as long as you've suggested to the IRB that you will, but you also need to keep as much of the information as you can without the confidential information, so that in the future, if anybody wants to verify or validate your results, that they can use that data as well. Make sure that you don't duplicate or piecemeal publications. You want to only submit material to one publication at a time. And you want to make sure that you're not kind of recycling previously published information. And then make sure that you state who owns the data? Is it going to be the researcher, the participants, who owns the data, and who are you going to give that data to? And then, of course, making sure that you have demonstrated there's a lack of conflict of interest and that you have considered ethical issues in the development and implementation of your study. All right, so let's practice. Let's practice with the 2014 ACA Code of Ethics. I've given you the link here if you don't already have a copy. I would tell you that I strongly, absolutely, positively encourage you to have a copy of the 2014 ACA Code of Ethics on your desktop of any computer that you use. And I actually keep a copy on my phone as well because I reference it so often, so frequently. So it's really important to make sure that you have access to that. So pause this video if you need to download or find a copy of the Code of Ethics. It's also linked in the course room. And once you have that, come on back and join again, and we will start the exercise. All right, so for this exercise, what we're going to do is you're going to have 2 statements per page. And what I want you to do is when the statements come up, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to look through the ACA Code of Ethics, specifically looking at Section G, which is the research section. And I want you to identify, is this a true or false statement? And what code or what part of the code, what standard supports your answer, okay? So I'll pull up each statement. I'll let you know that it's time to pause and try to find out the answer and the code that goes with it, and then come back and I'll go over the answers, okay? So we're gonna pause here so that you can find the answer to the first 2. So pause and then come back and join me. All right. So I hope you found the answers to both of these. So the first one, counselors should contribute to the knowledge base of the profession. Absolutely, positively true. And this is actually in the introduction of Section G. And this is something I like to point out to students, that as a former ethics chair and former ACA Ethics Review Board member, that it's really important for you to recognize that you are responsible not only for the numbered parts of the standard, but for every single part of the standard. So the introductions to each section and the preamble to the ACA code are all parts of the code that you can be held liable for. So in this particular one, our introduction does say we are responsible for contributing to the knowledge base of the profession. For statement 2, if a counselor conducts research that shows an intervention is ineffective, the counselor has no obligation to share the information because only effective interventions should be published. This is false. G4B says obligation to report unfavorable results. Now, I give you a suggested standard. It doesn't mean that if you have a different standard that that's necessarily wrong, but these are what I think are the best standards to support the answers. So in this situation, this is a little bit tricky because unfortunately, a lot of our journals will only publish effective interventions or positive outcomes or significant outcomes, which is called journal bias. And it's something that we're dealing with across many, many journals, across all sorts of professions. And that is that journals don't want to publish things that are what are considered not significant. But the problem is, not significant results are just as important to me as a clinician as significant. I need to know what works with whom, and I need to know what doesn't work with whom. And so that's a little bit of an issue with our journals, that they only like to publish the significant results, which leaves us with a huge gap in our literature. All right, so let's look at statement 3 and 4. So I want you to pause the video here and take a look at the ACA Code of Ethics. I promise you'll get a lot more out of this if you actually play along with my games and actually dig into that Section G and see if you can find the answers for yourself before hearing what I think the answers are. So pause here and come back in a minute and start up again, and we'll go over the answers. All right. So for statement 3, researchers must make available sufficient details about original research that other researchers could replicate, so that other researchers can replicate the study. The answer is true. G4E, replication of studies. So you need to give people information. That's why you'll often see at the bottom of the first page of articles that it'll say, for more information, contact the first author, and it'll give their email address or phone number, and that's why they're doing that. Statement 4. As long as the research measurement is relevant to the treatment of a client, a counselor can utilize the data collected without the client consenting to the research. Nope, can't do that. And I actually have two standards that I cited here, G2A, informed consent in research, and G2C, client participation. Both of those are relevant to supporting a false on statement 4. Let's look at statement 5 and 6. So statement 5 and 6, a researcher, well, actually pause here and find the answers for yourself, and then come back and we will go over the answers. So pause here. All right, so hopefully you found the answers to these two. A counselor in private practice can conduct research without peer review. False. G1C. Independent researchers have to have the same type of standards as other researchers, say in academic institutions. They may just have to create their own review board. So it's important that you do have your research reviewed. This is also one of the reasons why, as part of our final project, we're doing peer reviews, because that's part of our ethical process. For statement 6, counselors must debrief clients after research participation and explain the nature of the study. True. G2G, explanations after data collection. This also applies to if there's any type of deception, you would have to explain that and demystify that process for the client. All right, so now we're up to statement 7 and 8. Take time to read these, pause the video, and come back once you've had the answers and the supporting standards, and you've spent some time delving into section G, and I will give you the answers. All right, so in statement 7, Maria, a student researcher, is nearing the end of her data collection when she realizes several participants failed to complete a portion of the assessment. Since she knows the participants, she completes the information on their behalf. Ethical or not? Absolutely not. G4A, accurate results. We cannot anticipate, guess, or hypothesize on what our participants would have said or done. We can't fill in the blanks. We have to decide what we're going to do with the blanks. Do we go back to our participants? Do we just throw out the whole data collection from that participant? What are we going to do with it? Why? And have a rationale for what we're doing. Statement 8, to ensure publication of findings, counselors are encouraged to submit findings for publication by several journals simultaneously. No go. False. Just G5G, duplicate submission. We're not allowed to submit the same article to multiple journals, because if they both accept the journal, we have a copyright issue. Who owns that article? So you can only submit one at a time, and you have to have a full denial before you can submit to another journal. And it's all about copyright and not having multiple people owning the same article, because that's not legally possible. All right, last two statements. Statement 9 and 10, please pause your video, delve into section G, find your answers and support them with the standard, and then come back and I will go over the answers with you. So statement 9, case examples may only be used with individuals, the individuals involved, I should say when the individual involved has reviewed the case materials and agreed to the disclosure of the material. True. G5A, use of case samples. So it's important for the case examples that may be used in a presentation or anything, you've got to have full, absolute disclosure and permission from the client to use that information. Statement 10, the order of authors on a publication ranks the authors from the one who contributed the most to the one who contributed the least in the publication. True. G5B, contributors. So that's a very important thing, and it's one of the reasons why you can't reorder or alphabetize the citation for your sources. You need to keep the citation in the order of authors as presented on the article or book or publication, so that the authors get the credit for the work that they did. So I hope this exercise was helpful in you delving a little bit more deeply into section G, and I welcome questions or concerns that you have on our Ask the Instructor thread. And one last note, begin to think about what are some of the ethical considerations that you'll need to consider when you're doing your group proposal. Thinking about your topic, what are these ethical considerations that I've discussed or Creswell's discussed that, yeah, we're going to have to think about that, okay? Because that's going to be an important part of your final project. I hope this presentation has been helpful to you. Please let me know if you have questions or concerns, and I will see you soon.